Hello, and welcome to School to Homeschool. My name is Janae Daniels. I'm a wife, a mother of 6, and a former middle school teacher turned homeschool mom. I have kids in their 20s all the way down to elementary age and everything in between. Are you thinking about pulling your kids from the public school system like I did, but you are scared to death and don't know what to do next? My friends, I felt the exact same way. And you have come to the right place. I want to help your family leave the system so that you can take the hearts and minds of your children back. Hello, my friends, and welcome back. For those new to the podcast, we'd like to welcome you. Welcome to the School to Homeschool podcast, where we discuss what it takes when we pull our kids from the public school system, which I've noticed over the last, several years, the mentality of those who have always homeschooled tends to be a little bit different than those of us who pull our kids from the public school system. We tend to have shackles on our brains that we have to take off, whereas traditional homeschooling moms who've done it, since kindergarten, take those off pretty quickly, the shackles off, their brains pretty quickly and move on. And for those of us new to this, it's terrifying. So if you're here for the first time, know you're in good company. We know it's scary. We know it's terrifying, and everything's going to be okay. So give yourself some grace, especially if you're brand new and are just starting to take the shackles off your brain of what education is supposed to look like versus what education really, really, truly is. I'm excited to have you. And I'm excited to talk about today's subject, which keeps coming up. And so I want to start with a quote by my good friend, Tina Hollenbeck, who was on the program a few weeks ago. She's the author of the Homeschool Resource Roadmap, where she has laid out all of the curriculums that are possible into one location. And that's a free resource, which I'll include in the show notes so that you can look at it. But this is in our private Facebook page, the School to Homeschool private Facebook page. She posted a quote that I feel like is really important. And I keep seeing it come up on Facebook, like this idea keep coming up on Facebook. So I want to read this quote to you, and then let's talk about it and what it means. It says, your state's educational standards for public school are not binding on homeschool families, but it's sad to see what has happened to homeschooling in recent years. It's as if we need to see a reformation in home education, one that calls families to return to the foundation, a reformation that admits that some have led us down the wrong path into the very system from which we were set free so long ago. Walt Mansfield, Train Them Up Ministries, Ohio. So thank you, Tina, for sharing that quote. So let's talk about it for a second. And let's talk about the history of our education system for a second, which I am knee deep in the middle of 3 very huge volumes of the most comprehensive research that's done on the history of the education system by Kremlin. I'm still in the middle of reading it, and it's 3 very thick volumes. They're on my shelf right there. One's on my nightstand. That's the one I'm reading right now. My friends, prior to 1852, when Horace Mann pushed the state of Massachusetts to adopt mandatory government education for all students, of which he himself did not put his own 3 children in. He continued to home educate them. Prior to that, there were schools. There were common schools or ABC schools, but kids didn't spend all of their lives at school, and there weren't set curriculums. There weren't, other than the New England Primer, which is the 1777 version, and the American Spelling Book, The Rudiments of the English Language for the Youth of Schools in the United States by Noah Webster. There wasn't set curriculums per se. Those texts were used. Of course, the Bible was used. These are, by the way, biblically based. Interesting enough. The New England Primer, heavy on phonics. really heavy. But they, they, not all kids, number one, went to school. Most of them were educated at home. And when parents could afford to send their kids, they would. So these were called common schools. Sometimes they were called ABC schools. In the 1600s, they came up with the Old Deluder of Satan Act, where if 50 families were in an area, they would have to hire a teacher to teach children how to read so that they could read the Bible, so that they could fight Satan. Okay. Again, it's the Ye Old Deluder of Satan Act, late 1600s. And so it's not until 1852 that we have any sort of government run schools. Public schools are government run. They are government run schools. Granted, states rule over their own education systems. Each state has their own Department of Education. And then school districts have some amount of flexibility within the school districts. But the way that education is done is based on a Prussian model from like roughly 1818. A model that was designed to get children to do what they were told, not to be free thinkers. Okay? You need to understand this. I didn't know that. I didn't know that until after I started homeschooling and started studying it. And this is months after I started homeschooling. I was always a big proponent of public education, as I was a public school teacher. And my oldest two kids graduated from public school. And my kids, up until 3.5 years ago, were in public school. And I was very against homeschooling and, frankly, ignorant. And I think that's where most of our society is in a state of ignorance. However, 2020 woke up a lot of families, and we happen to be one of those families that it woke up to, oh my gosh, maybe public school isn't all it's cracked up to be, right? And we've certainly seen something different. But my son got in an argument at a camp out last night with an adult about public education. And he's like, no, we need this foundation and all of this, all of this stuff. And public schools teach you how to learn. And that's BS. They don't teach you how to learn. As a matter of fact, it turns children off to learning. By third grade, kids don't want to learn anymore. Most kids dread school, and they see it as a chore as opposed to being beautiful and exciting and new. And yet that's not how they start out. As humans, we're inquisitive and we're full of wonder, and we want to learn new things, right? The beauty of homeschooling is we can take that love of learning back and help our children to love learning again. That's what we can do as parents. Now, back to this quote. Okay, so what's happened in the homeschooling world is when the advent of homeschooling, it was back in the 70s when it started to take shape again, and people wanted to homeschool, and there was reformers trying to change laws so people could homeschool and not be beholden to government education. So we get some early adopters like John Holt. And then we have people like John Taylor Gatto, which is like in the 90s. And we have all these other educational reformers who are like, no, government education it's not all it's cracked up to be, right? It's not producing what it's meant to. Instead, it's dumbing our kids down. John Taylor Gatto wrote a book called that, Dumbing Us Down. He was a public school teacher for 30 years. He knew what was happening in the system. So what's happened in the homeschooling world and all those early pioneers fighting for the freedom to educate, a lot of them didn't have curriculums to use. Not even a lot of them. They did not have curriculums to use, right? They taught their kids. I love Julie Bogart was on the program a few weeks ago. If you have not listened to her, the woman is brilliant. If you've never read The Brave Learner, it is well worth your time. One of my favorite books on homeschooling. It made me excited to homeschool. And one of the things she talked about is all she had was a family fun magazine and the library. when she was homeschooling her kids. And she had 5 kids, and now they're adults, and she has grandchildren, and her kids are intensely well educated. Many went to college, started their own businesses, all of these different things. And all she had was a family fun magazine and the library, right? She didn't have a million curriculums. But we now have so many options. I think Tina said there's over 6,000 options of curriculums that we tend to get lost in the curriculum mud. And we become like a repeat of public school at home, but that's not why we homeschool. We homeschool to teach our children freedom, to come to love learning again, and all of these, just to eat up learning. So I want to talk about getting back to the basics, because and I still do this sometimes, like the early days of our homeschooling, I had a whole list of things that I wanted my kids to learn. To my chagrin, the very first thing, looking back now, that I did when we started homeschooling was I went to our state public school standards to find out where my children needed to be at what grade level. Which is funny, because several years ago, I remember sitting and thinking, who decided what our kids would learn at any given time? Who decided that? Who made that decision? Like, what person sitting in some office somewhere said, 3rd graders need to learn X, Y, Z. 5th graders need to learn X, Y, Z. Like, who decided that? Do you know? I don't know. I don't know. Just a bunch of people in the Department of Education just made this decision. Like, who decided that? Push this way. And yet, so the first thing I did was went to our state standards, which, okay, these are the 2020 Colorado academic standards. I'm in the state of Colorado. This one is 43 pages. This is the 3rd grade standards for physical science. And it has all the patterns, grade level expectation. Patterns of motion can be used to predict future motion. And then it lists out all these things that the child needs. Objects in contact exert forces on each other, electric, magnetic forces, blah, blah, blah. It goes on. And this is just 3rd grade, and it's 43 pages long of the academic standards for 3rd graders. Okay. Every subject has its own standards of science, reading, writing, communicating, physical education, music, mathematics, drama, and theater. When I was a teacher, I relied on the Texas state standards. My expectation as a public school teacher was that I would meet all of the standards outlined in the TEKS, the Texas education standards. Dance, it has computer science, comprehensive health, all of these academic standards, and they are all, when you put them all together, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of pages long. And the mistake that I made at the beginning was I felt like my kids had to learn everything. So it was as if I was going to be a public school teacher to my kids at home. This was a mistake. So I listed out all the things that my kids, okay, I need them to learn history, and I need them to learn this, and we're going to do this every day, and we're going to do this, and we're going to do this every day, and we're going to do this every day, and we're going to do science, and we're going to do blah, 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 and all of the things. I kept pushing more and more squishing it into the schedule. And those have listened to my first few episodes, it was a disaster. It wasn't until much later that I read the homeschool standards for the state of Colorado. And these are the homeschool standards. Again, the state standards for government schools in my state are hundreds of pages long. These are the homeschool standards for the state of Colorado. Colorado law states that homeschool programs must include, but are not limited to, the subjects of, are you ready for this? Communication skills of reading, writing and speaking, mathematics, history, civics, literature, science, and regular courses of instruction in the Constitution of the United States. By the way, that's an expectation for public school, and I don't think most public schools are hitting the Constitution very well. If they are, heaven only knows what they're doing with it now. Homeschool programs must have no less than 172 days of instruction, averaging 4 contact hours per day. The selection of curriculum is at the discretion of the parent who is overseeing the homeschooling program. Okay, did you hear that? It wasn't hundreds of pages long. It was communication skills of reading, writing, and speaking, mathematics, history, civics, literature, science, and regular courses of instruction on the Constitution of the United States. Now, the interesting thing about this, that's it. It doesn't tell me what math they have to learn. It doesn't tell me what history they have to learn. Man, the history of the world is really, really vast. But it doesn't tell me I have to learn certain pieces of history, right? It doesn't say you have to study the French Revolution. You have to study the dynasties in China. You have to study, it doesn't say that. If you go to the Colorado standards for public school, it's very specific what is to be taught and when it's to be taught. Okay, so I rewound, right? I had to put a pause on my homeschooling because it became very overwhelming for me as a parent and also for my kids when I'm like, we have to fit all of this in all of the time. And now I started erasing things and getting rid of stuff and going, okay, what are the very most important things that my kids need to learn? And at the same time, I still have to adhere to the state standards, right? I'm beholden to these little standards, this little paragraph of standards. So what do I do? And I went, okay, what did our founding fathers have to learn? Throughout the history of the world, what do people have to learn? What do the greatest minds in history have to learn? And it always comes back to the same three things. The three R's, which is funny because writing doesn't start with an R, it starts with a W. And arithmetic also doesn't start with an R, it starts with an A. But it sounds good, the three R's, right? Children need to learn to read, they need to learn to write, they need to learn to do arithmetic. And arithmetic and math are actually not the same thing. I learned. I didn't know that. They're not. Now, we're going to be talking about reading in great detail. I have a dyslexia specialist coming on in the future. We're working that out. I was talking to her yesterday. And I'm going to go into depth about reading because, man, our schools have screwed up over the last several decades with reading and whole language and leaving phonics by the wayside. And anyway, I will go into that in a different episode where we talk about the literacy rate in the United States, which will make you want to vomit. That's for another episode. And I'm still gathering all the research because I want to present you with the good research that's out there. But I want to hammer these three things today and talk about reading, writing, and math. Okay. The most important thing, we've talked about reading to your kids every day. Read aloud is so important, right? Continue to do that. But our kids have got to know how to read. They have got to know how to write. They have to know how to write because we have to be able to communicate our thoughts onto paper. Now, a few weeks ago, my 16-year-old, for her 16th birthday, asked to go see Dr. Jordan Peterson speak in person. He was here visiting. Now, some of you might be like, oh, I don't like that guy. Fine, that's okay. I happen to like him. My daughter listens to him regularly. She's 16. While some of her public school friends wanted to go see Taylor Swift, which is fine, my daughter had no desire to hear Taylor Swift. She wanted to go hear a psychologist talk about the wrestle with God, okay? Which I was kind of proud. Like, that was a proud mom moment for me. Again, whether or not you like Dr. Peterson is beside the point. He said something really, really important. There was a question answer period, and somebody asked a question, and I don't even remember what the question was. But he's like, it is so imperative that people learn how to write, because writing forces people to condense their thoughts into the most like basic idea. And it forces people to get their thoughts into the basic idea to communicate. And he talked about how we need to know how to write well so that we can communicate via the written word. And we are writing all the time, right? We are texting, we're writing on social, posting on social media. We might be sending emails to people. My kids have started literally writing formal letters again. My daughter, my 8-year-old, is writing a letter to her cousin today. And again, we got out the quill and the fancy paper. And anyway, that's how she likes to write her letters. But that made me think. So I was talking to my daughter, and my daughter's actually a pretty decent writer. She aced both of her college writing classes as a 14-year-old, her composition writing classes. And so she and I have been talking about that, which has made me go back to thinking we need to know how to read. We need to learn how to write, and we need to know basic arithmetic. So if you don't do anything else in your homeschool but teach your kids to read, write, and do basic math, and we'll talk about teaching your kids to read in a future episode, because you as a parent absolutely can do it, and you're going to do a better job than most of the public schools, especially the ones that are teaching whole language. You're going to blow them out of the water. Just teach them phonics. Anyway, we'll go over that later. There's going to be some of you who are teachers going to be like, oh no, but I will give you the research. Okay. But that, again, that's for a future episode. So we need to get back to the basics, because if our children can read and read well, and if they can write and communicate well, and they can do basic math, then they can learn anything. And we can help them to learn and find answers and all of that good stuff. Okay. Really quick note on arithmetic. What's the difference between mathematics and arithmetic? The dictionary defines of these two bodies of learning are: arithmetic is, number one, the branch of mathematics that deals with addition, subtraction, multiplication, and division, and the use of numbers in calculations. Mathematics is the study of the relationships among numbers, shapes, and quantities. It uses signs, symbols, and proofs, and includes arithmetic, algebra, calculus, geometry, and trigonometry. Okay, I would argue that our kids really only need arithmetic, and when they need the higher math, they can get it, and they'll get it quickly. And oftentimes they get it very, very, very quickly when they're a little bit older, because they're mentally mature enough to handle it, and it goes fast. Like they zip through it when they're ready. Okay, so I would also argue, in addition to addition, subtraction, multiplication, and division, kids need to know percents, and they need to know decimals, and they need to know basic fractions, right? If they're going to cook, they need to know basic fractions. So reading, writing, arithmetic. Now I want to talk about our founding fathers for just a second. Oh, and then we're going to talk about, after we talk about that and our founding fathers, I want to discuss with you for a few minutes, how do you add the other subjects in, and what do you do so it's not overwhelming? Because there might be things on your heart that you really want to teach your kids. And yes, you're going to teach the kids those things. You're going to teach them the Constitution, and you're going to teach them all these other things. But we'll get to that. How do we add those in where it doesn't become overwhelming? Okay, so let's talk about our founding fathers for just a minute. The miniseries just came out about Benjamin Franklin. I have not watched it yet. I'll be interested to see what they have to say about him and how they portray him. I'm very fascinated by our founding fathers. I know that lots of people have ugly things to say about them, and usually it's people who are ignorant and hate our country. If I'm going to be completely blunt, it's people who embrace things that I'm like, why? Like, you wouldn't have the freedoms that you do if they didn't exist, or if they hadn't done what they had done. But anyway, that's another discussion for another time, and it just makes my blood boil. This is from the autobiography of Benjamin Franklin. Now, Benjamin Franklin came from a very, very large family, and he was one of the younger children. He said, my elder brothers, this is from his autobiography, written by himself, published, I believe, in 1773, so 3 years prior to the American Revolution, the Declaration of Independence, as the revolution was happening. My elder brothers, is when this was published. Okay. I quote, my elder brothers were all put apprentices to different trades. I was put to the grammar school at 8 years of age, my father intending to devote me as the tithe of his sons to the service of the church. My early readiness in learning to read, which must have been very early, as I do not remember when I could not read, and the opinion of all his friends that I should certainly make a good scholar encouraged him in the purpose of his. My uncle Benjamin, too, approved of it and proposed to give me all his shorthand volumes of sermons, which is funny. I took shorthand in high school, and oh my gosh, it's like a different language. Anyway, I don't even think they teach it anymore. Anyway, his shorthand volumes of sermons, I suppose, as a stock to set up with if I would learn his character. I continued, however, at the grammar school not quite 1 year, though in that time I had risen gradually from the middle of the class of that year to be the head of it, and farther was removed into the next class above it in order to go with that into the third at the end of the year. But my father, in the meantime, from a view of the expense of a college education, which having so large a family he could not well afford, and the mean living many so educated were afterwards able to obtain, reasons that he gave to his friends in my hearing altered his first intention, took me from the grammar school and sent me to a school for writing and arithmetic. Did you hear that? He already could read. So the little grammar school that he's going to only focuses on writing and arithmetic. Kept by a then famous man, Mr. George Brownell, very successful in his profession generally, and that by mild, encouraging methods. Under him, I acquired fair writing pretty soon, but I failed in the arithmetic and made no progress in it. At 10 years old, I was taken home to assist my father in his business, which was that of a tallow chandler and soap boiler, a business he was not bred to, but had assumed on his arrival in New England, and on finding his dying trade would not maintain his family, being in little request. Accordingly, I was employed in cutting wick for the candles, filling the dipping mold and the molds for the cast candles, attending the shop, going of errands, etc. Okay, so he goes on, right? Did you catch how long he was in grammar school for, my friends, to learn to write and do arithmetic? He doesn't remember when he learned how to read. At some point, his mom or his sisters taught him to read. My guess is using the New England Primer, because that was inexpensive and small enough that most families could afford it. But he goes on, he says, from a child, so he was there for 2 years, 8 to 10 years old. He was in school for 2 years. That's it. Okay. So he goes on. From a child, I was fond of reading, and all the little money that came into my hands was ever laid out in books. Pleased with the Pilgrim's Progress, my first collection was of John Bunyan's works in separate little volumes. Okay, so he would started to collect books, and he was totally came to love reading, right? Okay, he ends up becoming an apprentice for his brother in a print shop, which he didn't enjoy working for his brother. So eventually, as a teenager, he stowed away and left. And anyway, his story is really fascinating. The autobiography of Benjamin Franklin, really worth reading. Okay, he goes on and he talks about how he became a better writer, better at rhetoric, and better at logic. Okay, so give me a second, because this is a couple paragraphs, but I want you to listen to it. And it's kind of funny also, as it talks about, we get some amount of the character of Benjamin Franklin. Again, he sometimes gets a bad rap with women. However, I think this shows insight into his character towards women, but also towards writing and education. True education, because education doesn't always mean schooling. Okay, education can take all sorts of forms. I quote, "There was another bookish lad in town, John Collins by name, with whom I was intimately acquainted. We sometimes disputed, and very fond we were of argument, and very desirous of confuting one another with disputations turn, by the way, is apt to become a very bad habit, making people often extremely disagreeable in company by the contradiction that is necessary to bring it into practice. And thence, besides souring and spoiling the conversation, is productive of disgusts and perhaps enmities where you may have occasion for friendship." I had caught it by reading my father's books of dispute about religion. Did you hear that? He had been reading books about religion and disputes of religion, which is where he started to really enjoy debate. He goes on. Persons of good sense, I have since observed, seldom follow into it, except lawyers, university men, and men of all sorts that have been bred at Edinburgh. So that cracks me up. People who like to dispute, attorneys, people of universities, and the Scottish people, those of Edinburgh. Anyway, that kind of cracked me up. A question was once, somehow or other, started between Collins and me of the propriety, listen to this, of the propriety of educating the female sex in learning and their abilities for study. He was of the opinion that it was improper and that they were naturally unequal to it. I took the contrary side, perhaps a little for dispute's sake. He was naturally more eloquent, had a ready plenty of words, and sometimes, as I thought, bore me down more by his fluency than by the strength of his reasons. As we parted without settling the point, and we were not to see one another again for some time, I sat down. Now listen to this carefully. I sat down to put my arguments in writing, which I copied fair and sent to him. He answered, and I replied. 3 or 4 letters of a side had passed when my father happened to find my papers and read them. Without entering into the discussion, he took occasion to talk to me about the manner of my writing. Observe that though I had the advantage of my antagonist in correct spelling and pointing, which I owed to the printing house, because he was working as a apprentice, I fell far short in elegance of expression, in method, and in perspicuity, of which he convinced me by several instances. I saw the justice of his remarks, and thence grew more attentive to the manner in writing and determined to endeavor at improvement. Okay, so he's writing letters back and forth, and it's his father's pointing out that his persuasion is not great. His rhetoric is not good. And so he's bound and determined to become a better writer. But it's through writing that he's able to articulate his thoughts. Isn't that fascinating? He could read, but then he realized he had to be a better writer. His dad was able to point some things out to him, and then he took it upon himself. It goes on to talk about how, he read some things and he wanted to become a better writer. And so he sought to practice in writing. Ultimately, he becomes a great statesman, first millionaire in the United States, blah, blah, all the things in the colonies and then the United States and all the things. Okay, so that's Benjamin Franklin, right? What was his education? Reading, writing. He didn't even like arithmetic. Eventually, he learned arithmetic. Now, it's interesting because with his limited 2-year education from the ages of 8 to 10, ultimately in his lifetime, he was granted honorary degrees from multiple Ivy League universities. Isn't that fascinating? Somebody with very little education, but yet he could read, he could write, and he could do basic math, albeit he hated it. Okay, eventually he got better at arithmetic. Let's talk about George Washington for a second. Okay. What was, and this comes from theclassicalconversations.com, which is an educational philosophy. It falls under the classical philosophy. Anyway, their website, it says, what was George Washington's education like? Although his 2 older brothers attended a grammar school in England for a few years, George Washington's education in the formal sense was quite limited. When Washington was just 11 years old, his father passed away. This left the family limited funds for education and ended Washington's formal education, which included, listen to this, math, reading, and writing. After his father's death, although Washington busied himself by taking on the responsibility of running the family farm, he continued learning by teaching himself through reading and experimentation. 3 significant influences contributed to Washington's early social education. an etiquette manual dating to the 16th century called The Rules of Civility and Decent Behavior in Company and Conversation, which you can get on Amazon, guidance from his half-brother, Lawrence Washington, and the influence of Lawrence's respected in-laws, the Fairfax family. Knowledge of surveying or math skills, which Washington gained largely through self-study, would have been meaningless for his social advancement without displaying appropriate manners. From an early age, Washington used the rules of civility to master the arts of interpersonal skills and self-control that were crucial to his future leadership. He goes on to say that with his brother, he learns riding, like horseback riding, hunting, fencing, dancing. He loved to dance. And then he goes on. Okay. And then it says, by the time George Washington entered adulthood, he had mastered the techniques of self-presentation that would later help him shape and refine his public image. His famed poise and reputation for humble virtues were in many ways an outgrowth of the lessons that he first encountered in the rules of civility. And so that you know, I didn't include this. He literally hand copied all of the rules of civility until he committed them to memory. He hand wrote them, which also helped him become a better writer. Okay, so he hand wrote all of the rules of civility, which I don't own this book, but I'm about to, because as soon as I'm finished with the podcast, I'm going to order it from Amazon. I'll include the link below so you can, in the show notes, so you can have that. Okay, it goes on, talks about Abraham Lincoln. Most people know that Abraham Lincoln received minimal formal schooling, instead educated himself by reading books borrowed from neighbors. A tall, strapping young man, Lincoln was needed on the family farm and could only attend formal schooling during the winter months. He attended 3 or 4 ABC schools, which were often held in log cabins and where the teachers were barely more educated than their pupils. Lincoln later estimated that his total formal schooling did not amount to more than 1 year. He never attended an academy or college. Books were scarce on the Indiana frontier, but besides the family Bible, which Lincoln knew well, he also got his hands on classics like Aesop's Fables, The Pilgrim's Progress, and Robinson Crusoe. He also devoured William Grimshaw's The History of the United States and Mason Locke Weems' Life and Memorable Actions of George Washington. Isn't that fascinating? Both books he borrowed from his neighbors. The biography of Washington in particular made a lasting impression on Lincoln, and he quickly adopted the ideals of Washington and the other founding fathers as his own. Did you hear that? Reading and writing. Like, he learned to read, and because he could read, he then studied the character of their people like Washington. Okay, goes on to talk about he started reading books like Shakespeare, the 6 books of Euclid. He went to the Library of Congress often, blah, blah, blah. Okay, now listen to this. Both George Washington and Abraham Lincoln share one thing in common, and I would argue Benjamin Franklin as well. Side note. When it comes to these men's schooling, they each took responsibility and ownership for their own education. Although they both received little formal education, they were determined to become lifelong learners. Committing to self-education, they read any book they could get their hands on and engaged in conversation with others to learn the various subjects and skills. Their humble pursuit of wisdom and love for God and country prepared both Washington and Lincoln to meet some of the most significant challenges any American presidents ever faced. Okay. And what were they taught in, my friends? Reading, writing, and arithmetic. The 3 basics. And then from there, they used those 3 things to become the foundation of everything else that they learned. Benjamin Franklin was the same. He learned to love to read, he learned to be a good writer, and he learned arithmetic, albeit he hated it. So if we can get our kids to learn to love reading and writing and do basic math, they can learn anything. We're going to talk in the future about how do you get children to learn to love to read, especially some of those teenage boys who have come to hate it. That won't be today, but we'll get there. Okay. So if you can do nothing else, my friends, again, keep reading to your kids, right? That's so important. Read to your children. That will help their literacy. But if you can help them foster a love of reading and writing and basic math. And how do we do that? We do that in natural ways. Now, there's sometimes we have to physically teach a child. There's some children that aren't like Benjamin Franklin, who learn at an early age. My daughter didn't really start to learn to read until age 7. She's now 8. And she spent the last 3 hours writing a letter to her cousins. There's 2 letters that she's writing, right? And she suddenly just wants to learn more and more and more. And so we're working on the phonics, and we are working on sound combination. We're working on all of that. She's a decent reader. Like, she's above grade level right now where she's at, but we're still a great, and I say grade level with air quotes, right? She's coming to love writing, and I'm not forcing her to write the letter. She's writing these letters because she wants to write them. So if we can instill a love for writing, not by pushing it and shoving it down their throats, but inviting them to love it, then that's where the beauty and the magic happens. Now, in my state standards, I have other stuff that I have to cover. I have to cover the Constitution, which I believe is very important. And I have to cover civics, which I believe is very important. I also want to teach my children poetry, and I also want to teach my children history, and I also want to teach my children science and all these things. So how do we do it without overwhelming us and our kids? Well, make sure that each week you have the foundation of the 3: reading, writing, arithmetic. Arithmetic might include your learning to cook together. It might having your kids help you budget. For your older kids, you might be talking about taxes and what that looks like. Right now, my 16-year-old is filing his taxes. And we've been talking about taxes all week long because he has to have them sent in by Monday because he wants his tax returns for the time that he's been working. But what I've done is, rather than trying to squish everything in every day, we add the extra things once a week. And sometimes we take a break from them for several weeks. So the last couple of weeks, we've taken a break from civics. I happen to like the Tuttle twins. It is libertarian leaning. I'm not necessarily a libertarian, but I like what Connor Boyack has done with those books. So that's one thing that we do is once a week with my kids, we'll read one of the Tuttle twins books, or we'll read the American history book that he's put out now. You can take a look at their website and look at what they offer. Perhaps you read a historical fiction about something, whether, you read The Borrowed House, which is about World War II, or you read about The Little House on the Prairie, and you get some amount of history, a little bit of history with that, with your younger kids, or you read whatever books. Like, there's so many historical fiction books, and you discuss what's true and what's not true, what's real and what's not real. Maybe you read Guts and Glory, which are watered down history books written for boys, right? And maybe you read that every day, or once a week, you're like, once a week, we're going to study history. And then we're going to take a break from history for a few weeks. And then we're going to study principles of science, or we're going to learn about Isaac Newton for a few weeks. You don't have to do it all every day. You could do it once a week and then take a break from it for a few weeks and then come back to it. Maybe you want to learn about other cultures. And so you're like, for this month, we're going to learn about France. My kids really are obsessed with France right now. My 2 youngest, I don't know why, they are. So in the fall, we spent some time learning about France, and we made food from France. And once a week, we learned something about France, right? And we got French culture, and we were learning the language, and, and we did that for a time. Now we're moving into spring and summer, and my 7-year-old really wants to learn more about bugs and insects. So we're going to spend about once a week learning about bugs and insects. And I might even order some more butterflies, or I might even order some tadpoles because she's really into frogs as well. So order some tadpoles, or, go to the pet store and look at some frogs, and then get some books from the library on those subjects, right? You don't have to do all the things all the time. You can do it in little seasons. I love the quote from the scriptures: to everything there is a season and a time for every purpose under heaven, right? You can go in seasons and talk about things in groups, and it's okay. And maybe you study it for 2 weeks, or maybe you study it for 6 months, or whatever the subject. One of the things that I realized I really want to study with my kids is the Greek myths. I'm reading Till We Have Faces by C.S. Lewis right now, which is based on the myth of Cupid and Psyche. I've read it before. I love the book. It's definitely for adults. It's a heavy book. Teens could read it too. They might appreciate it, but it's a beautiful book. But I realized, man, I have this book of Greek myths. I'd really like to spend time over the next few weeks, maybe once or twice a week, reading some of the Greek myths and looking up stuff on Greece and Rome and what was going on. Sometimes we'll listen to Story of the World, which is by Susan Wise Bauer. And we'll listen to that in the car. You can get that on Audible. You can check it out. I think you can check it out from a lot of libraries. I ended up buying the CDs and we stick them in the car, and then they just put them on Audible recently. So I'm like, oh, I could have waited, but I didn't. And so we'll listen to that for world history as it tells the stories. And when the kids are like, oh, I want to learn more about that piece of history, then we can go and pull books from the library. But going back to the original, that original quote, we don't have to do these rigorous curriculums for our kids to learn. Remember, our founding fathers gained a love of learning because they could read, they could write, and they could do basic math. And once you can do those things, you can learn anything at any time if you're good at those 3 things: reading, writing, basic math. Then beyond that, you can explore. Your job as a parent, yes, introduce them to all different subjects and all different things, but don't put so much on your plate that you end up not wanting to do anything. So stick to the basics, right? You can read, you can write, we're going to cook, or we're going to learn budgeting, or we're going to, do these other things to learn basic math. We're going to learn subtraction, addition, multiplication, division. And then add in a little bit at a time the other things, but you don't have to do it all. You don't. And they're not going to retain it all anyway. They're going to retain what they're able to retain. That's one of my big beefs with school, is so much is put on these kids' plates that mentally they're, by the 3rd hour of the day, they're exhausted. And so how much are they actually retaining, especially when you get into high school and they don't like the subjects? They're not retaining it. They'll remember enough to take the tests, and then it's out of the brain. I can remember the slope-intercept formula from math, and beyond that, I'd have to look it all up, right? And I went through trigonometry in school, and yet how much do I actually remember? You ask yourselves that question: how much do you actually remember? There was so much stuff shoved into your brain, stuff that you weren't interested in. But yet, when you're interested in something now, you'll retain it, right? You'll learn it. So if you can really help your child read and love reading and write and become a good writer and do math, you'll be just fine. They'll be just fine. And they can do anything. And then on top of that, if you can instill a love for learning where it's fun to learn, where it's enjoyable to learn, where things are interesting and the world becomes their oyster, we'll start getting some Lincolns and some Washingtons and some Franklins again. And boy, do we desperately need them. We desperately need them now. And my friends, because of what you're doing with with your children, we can raise kids like that once again. I love you. I hope you have a really great week. We're going to be talking about literacy coming up, not next week necessarily, but it will be coming up. We're going to be talking about all sorts. There's so many things I want to discuss with you, especially as summer's coming, and what do we do about the summer, and do we have to get through curriculums? Again, I'm not a huge fan of curriculums. I do use them sometimes, but I'm not a huge fan. We don't have to imitate the school system. As a matter of fact, it's best if we don't. Because let's be honest, it's failing all over the place. So why copy a failing system? A system that's doing actually what it was meant to do, which is dumb our children down. You don't have to have your children dumbed down, and you are doing better for them. I love you. I'm praying for you. Have a great week. You got this, mamas and papas. We'll talk next week. If you enjoyed this today, please like and subscribe. You could also join our private Facebook group at School to Homeschool, or sign up for our newsletter at www.schooltohomeschool. Have a great day.